I'm Bert Deichsler. I'm one of the owners of the bookstore. First, I should tell you we're recording this session with the Kirsch family. I'm very excited to have procured these two heavyweights whom I have admired from a distance and up close and personal, as I will soon report. I regard the Kirsch family really as the Jewish literary equivalent of the Addams family, not the one with Uncle Fester and Gomez and Morticia, but really the John Quincy Adams and Henry Adams line of Adams families. The patriarch, Robert Kirsch, of course, was this extraordinary literary critic who was really the foundation of the intellectual infrastructure of Los Angeles as the literary critic for the Los Angeles Times for more than 2 decades, I would estimate, and in whose name the literary prize is awarded by the Los Angeles Times each year. The John Quincy Adams, I would say, of this group is Jonathan Kirsch, who, like John Quincy Adams, or JQA, as we history majors like to say, is a lawyer, and an extraordinary one at that. He is the go-to lawyer for literary agents and authors west of the Mississippi. So he's not one who has to have lunch every day at Michael's, but rather is at work dutifully for his clients. He's also an amazing, amazing writer on Jewish topics. I'd be surprised if there's anybody who's watching today who doesn't own at least Harlots by the Side of the Road, the Moses biography, or the King David biography. His most recent book, which came out, I guess, 5 or more years ago, is The Short, Strange Life of Herschel Greenspan. And it is remarkable for those of us who practice law to see what Jonathan has accomplished as a writer and as a lawyer. Not the least of his accomplishments is his role as a father to our main guest of the evening, Adam Kirsch. Adam, who's now an editor for the Wall Street Journal, is a prolific author, a great and wonderful poet, and a consistent writer on important Jewish themes. I've been, as I said earlier, I've been stalking Adam to try to get him to do one of these evenings. And unlike most people who are distraught at the idea of Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, for our bookstore, it has been a godsend because we're getting to find people who are even at 97th Street in Manhattan who are able to make their way to Los Angeles to spend an hour or so with us. I'd like to just start by urging people to buy and read The Blessing and the Curse, the Jewish people and their books in the 20th century. Had a couple of instant reactions, and before I turn it over to the interlocutor, Jonathan, I wanted to just give you some sense of this book. It contains a summary of a very interesting array of Jewish writers, about 30, I would estimate, united around the theme, I think, of the power of books to define what Jewish identity means. It's a survey of European writers, American writers, Israeli writers, and it concludes with a more philosophic bent, I think, about the Rabbi Heschels and Martin Buber's of the world and what they have to contribute to the conversation. It is so clearly written and so accessible that it puts me in mind of the observation that life is a humbling experience, because as you go through this book, one, you'll be struck by all the stuff you didn't know that you should have known. Secondly, that there is this extraordinary young man who is able to present it so clearly and so insightfully. And you wind up at the end of this thinking, I really want to read more and know more, which I think is one of the great gifts that any writer can give to a reader. So after that overlong introduction, let me welcome Jonathan Kirsch and Adam Kirsch. Thank you both for being here, and I'll turn the program over to the Kirsch family. Jonathan, Adam, let's get going, and thank you.
Thank you, Bert.
Thank you, Bert.
Before I put my first question to Adam, I'd like to make a couple of sentimental remarks. The first is that when I transitioned from a career in journalism to a career in law as a new associate at the law firm where Bert was already a very dynamic and well-regarded young partner, there was a conference room immediately adjacent to his office, which was known as the Deichsler Conference Room, which was, I think, a way of tipping the firm's hat to Bert as a force in the law. And it was in the Deichsler conference room that I took my very first deposition. And I'll never forget that. And I feel like it's a bond between Bert and me. I also want to share an experience that I had with Adam when he was a very young man. And generationally, he was responsible for bringing the first personal computer into our home. I probably already still in junior high. And I used to creep into his room literally before dawn to work on book reviews that I was writing for the Los Angeles Times, sitting at his desk just inches away from his sleeping figure. And I always felt over the years that, genetics aside, which obviously had a big role in it, that somehow I transmitted to my young son some of this passion for writing that runs in our family. Let me start with my first question to Adam. Who Wants to Be a Jewish Writer is the title of your book of essays that Yale University Press published last year. It may sound like a punchline to a Jewish joke, but I'd like to borrow the title to open and frame our conversation tonight about your new book. In Who Wants to Be a Jewish Writer, Adam, you write, much of my work over the past 10 years has been devoted to understanding what it really means to be a Jew and a Jewish writer in a Western secular society where Jews often find themselves outside the mainstream politically and intellectually. How does your answer to that question figure in the books and authors that you selected for inclusion in your new book, The Blessing and the Curse?
Well, first of all, thank you, Bert, for inviting us to do this, and especially thank you for describing me as a young man, because next month I'm going to be 46. So I'll take it. I'll take any young man I can get. And I'm really glad to be here with my dad, who I have done we've gotten to do a couple of events together over the years, and this one is going to be fun. Well, I think that growing up in our house, that the idea that Jewishness was a big subject, obviously not just in terms of going to synagogue and going to Hebrew school, but thinking about what it means and what it doesn't mean. And maybe, Dad, you want to talk a little bit about our sort of family history, but my great-grandfather was a settler in pre-state Palestine before the First World War, which made him part of the group called the Second Aliyah, which was very important in founding the state of Israel, though he eventually moved to the United States and New York and then Los Angeles. And his children, including my grandmother, my father's mother, spent time in Israel as a child. And so I think that the questions of Jewishness, Zionism, Israel, literature were always part of our family conversation and things that we were thinking and talking about. And I feel like both of us have written books to sort of try to figure out what this is all about, try to sort of define for ourselves what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be a Jewish reader and writer. One reason why I titled my book that, about Who Wants to Be a Jewish Writer, is partly because it sounds like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I didn't really think of that in time, but it was because of an event I did where I was moderating a conversation between two Jewish novelists here in New York, and I had reviewed both of their books. They were both very Jewish in subject matter. And I asked them as Jewish writers, and they both said, well, I'm not a Jewish writer. I don't want to be considered a Jewish writer. I'm a writer. Sometimes I write about Jews, sometimes I don't. And it occurred to me that, hey, I see my mom coming in.
Yeah, it's the whole family.
I thought it was interesting that even writers who are very much writing about Jewish subjects don't like to be thought of as Jewish writers. And in fact, even Philip Roth, who's the most Jewish writer of all, said numerous times, I'm not a Jewish writer, I'm an American writer. So in writing this book, The Blessing and the Curse, I wanted to see, is there some content or meaning to the idea of being a Jewish writer across languages and countries? Is there something that a German writer, a Yiddish writer, an American writer, an Israeli writer have in common that really makes them all part of one category other than the sort of ethnicity or the accident of being born Jewish? And so I've tried to look at what do these people all have to do with each other? What makes them one category?
Those of us who know your work well, I among them, recognize a continuity between the people and the books, one of your books published in 2016, and your new book, The Blessing and the Curse. The first book spans more than 2 millennia, begins with Deuteronomy and ends up with one of the Twentieth stories by Sholem Aleichem. The new book picks up with Franz Kafka and is wholly contained within the 20th century. Who were some of the writers that, if any, that you regarded as significant but didn't make the cut? What was your principle of inclusion and your principle of exclusion?
Well, I wanted to write a book about sort of the stories of Jewish literature in Europe, basically in the first half of the 20th century leading up to the Holocaust, in America, in Israel, and also about religious and sort of philosophical ideas about Jewishness as opposed to imaginative literature. And I think that I got to include most of the people that I wanted to include. I wasn't trying to pick the best writers or the most important writers. I wasn't trying to make some kind of a reading list or a canon. I was really looking for writers who I thought had interesting things to say about Jewishness. So there are Jewish writers who don't write about Jewishness at all. And of course, there are Jewish writers who aren't accessible to me because they haven't been translated. And all the people I write about, I talk about in English translation. But that still leaves a pretty wide range. So in this book, I talk about fiction and poetry and drama and essays and memoirs and diaries. And it's a pretty wide range of both what you'd call fiction and nonfiction. What I think is interesting is that if you read these books, and I spent a couple of years reading these books, you get a sense of the sort of whole sweep and outline of 20th century Jewish history. It's an interesting way of seeing how it felt to people at the time. Most of these writers aren't simply documenting what happened to them. They're telling stories or making literature out of it. But there are these very strong themes that come out and that really let you understand what it felt like to be a Jew in this period.
You pick up the book with Franz Kafka and you write of Kafka's The Trial, that the word Jew never actually appears in the book. And yet, as you write, Adam, it is entirely possible to read it without knowing or suspecting that Kafka was Jewish. Indeed, you say that the Jewishness of the trial is a kind of optical illusion, your words, visible only to those readers who were equipped to recognize it. What is the mental equipment that the reader needs in order to see through that illusion? And are there still such readers?
I think that one thing that comes up very much in the book in a variety of contexts is when a Jewish writer is writing for a general audience, in other words, mainly a non-Jewish audience, how do they maintain or represent Jewishness when writing for people who aren't interested in it and don't know about it? That doesn't really apply as much to Israeli writers because they're writing in Hebrew for Jewish people and basically will only be read, at least in Hebrew, by Jewish readers. But if you're talking about an American writer or a German writer like Kafka, they're writing basically for anyone who wants to read. And some people insist on putting Jewishness at the front and center of their work, and other people prefer to keep it in the background or have it be coded or metaphorical. Kafka is someone who is known worldwide. People read him in every country in the world and find him relevant in every country in the world, including countries where there are no Jewish traditions and no Jews at all. And he's been read in lots of different ways. People see him as a prophet of totalitarianism, of bureaucracy, all kinds of things that would come to pass in the 20th century after he died. He died in 1924, I think. And in this book, The Trial, which is, as most of you I'm sure know, is about a man who wakes up one morning and is told that he's being arrested and put on trial, but not by the police or the official government prosecutor, but by a secret court system that no one seems to know where it comes from or what its authority is, and it meets in places like attics and closets. And the main character, Joseph K., has these very bizarre Kafkaesque experiences where he's suddenly ushered into a courtroom and no one tells him what the charges are, but he has to try to defend himself. And at the end of the book, in the very last scene, he's killed. And if you don't know that Kafka was Jewish, if you don't know anything about Kafka's life or situation, there are lots of ways you can read this book. It could be read as being about guilt or about our relationship with God, or all kinds of, or being a victim of the state, as many people became in the decades after Kafka wrote. But if you do know that Kafka was in a Jewish family in Prague, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when he was born, and then later part of Czechoslovakia after World War I, that a lot of the things that he's writing about very clearly mirror or communicate the experiences of Jews in that setting at that time. In particular, the fact that they were both insiders and outsiders. They were faced with constant exclusion and anti-Semitism, even though someone like Kafka was contributing to German literature and writing in German. So it's very easy to see Joseph K.'s problem as he's Jewish, and that's a crime, and everyone is out to get him because of it. He doesn't know why, he doesn't understand it. He's trying to acquit himself. There are several scenes in which he sort of pleads for his life. But in the end, it's unsuccessful, and he's killed by these two men who came to arrest him. And in the very last scene, when he's being executed, Kafka writes, he looks up, this is on the street, he's having his throat cut on the street, and he looks up at the windows around him on the buildings and thinks, is anyone watching? Is anyone going to come to help me? And it's exactly how the Jews of Eastern Europe would have felt 15 years later, when they were wondering, is anyone going to come help us and rescue us? And of course, no one did, just as no one does for Joseph K. So even when he's writing in this more way that's like a parable or a fable, the sort of engine of it, I think, is really his Jewish experience. And I think that adds something to read it that way.
There are several novelists in your book, including Saul Bellow, S.Y. Agnon, and Isaac Basheva Singer. I need to pause here, apropos of what Bert said about author events, and also about my father and your grandfather, Bob Kirsch. In 1977 or 78, I read that Isaac Basheva Singer was doing a signing at a bookstore in Westwood, and I made a pilgrimage to that store, and I stood in the long signing line. And as I approached the great man, the shepherd at the bookstore said, "No inscriptions, no inscriptions, just signatures." But when I got up to him, I said, "Mr. Singer, can you inscribe it to me? My name is Jonathan Kirsch." And Isaac Basheva Singer looked up at me and he said, "Kirsch? Kirsch? Is this Robert Kirsch?" And I realized that my dad and your grandfather had a big reputation, big enough to reach even Singer. Let me return to my question. One of the ironies about Singer, and you touch on it, is that he was not wholly beloved among his fellow Yiddishists, a point that's made in a short story by Cynthia Ozick, another author who you celebrate in your book, and you mentioned that particular short story. Why was it that a Yiddish writer from a small town in Poland was a favorite in the New Yorker and Esquire, but not among his own landsmen?
it's a strange, the Isaac Bashevis Singer phenomenon is very strange. I mean, everything about his life is strange and tragic. But the fact that he became so popular later in his life is especially odd. And it gets to one of the things I talk about in the book about American literature, which is that there was a period from about 1950 to maybe 1975 when Jewish writers were at the very heart of American literature. And I was looking at the list of recipients of the National Book Award, and in that like 20 or 25-year period, something like 15 of the awards went to Jewish writers. That was the period when Bernard Malamud and Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and Norman Mailer and J.D. Salinger were all writing, and I talk about some of those people in the book. And Isaac Bashevis Singer also in that period became very popular and well-known in America. His first story to be translated into English was translated by Saul Bellow, Gimple the Fool. But the book of his that I write about was his first novel called Satan and Gore, which was published in 1935, and it was actually published just after he had fled the country, left Poland to come to America, where his older brother, Israel Joshua Singer, had preceded him. He had already emigrated, and Isaac Bashevis Singer came to New York, and he said, I knew already that there was no future in Poland and I had to get out. That was in 1935. So this book of his, Satan and Gore, he wrote it in Poland, but by the time it came out, he was in America. It was published in Yiddish, and it's a historical novel set in the 17th century at a time when the Jews of Eastern Europe were very demoralized and shaken because of a false messiah who had arisen and gotten a lot of people to believe that Shabbatai Zvi was the Messiah and that he was going to redeem the Jewish people and end their exile. And then this Shabbatai Zvi, a historical figure, ended up converting to Islam. When he was threatened with death or conversion, he converted to Islam. And it was this great sort of earthquake across the Jewish world in the 17th century. So Singer, writing in the 1930s, goes back to the 1660s and sets a novel there, and it's clearly about his own time. It's really a way of writing about his own time. And what it does is it shows a Jewish community that's been decimated, the way that the Jews of Eastern Europe, many communities were decimated after World War I, and don't know what to believe, don't know what to think. They've lost faith in the future. And it shows this community falling under the sway of charlatans and charismatic preachers and magicians, and finally sort of tearing itself apart. And it's as if Satan has come to this town, Gore. And what's interesting about the book in retrospect is that it's not a book about the Jews being destroyed by an invading army, which is what happened to them just a few years after that book was published. It's about the Jewish community falling apart from inside and not knowing what to believe and what its future is. And Singer, because that was his experience in the first part of his life, after the Holocaust, when he was in America and continued to write in Yiddish, he wasn't memorializing a sort of perfect, idyllic, lost world the way we sort of associate with Fiddler on the Roof. He was really writing about this real, very troubled, very divided intellectual world that he had grown up in. And he called attention to a lot of things like sex and disbelief and crisis of faith and supernaturalism that didn't fit with the image that a lot of Yiddish writers who had survived the Holocaust wanted people to have. Other Yiddish writers, particularly Chaim Grade, who was a novelist of the same generation, was much less known than Singer in America. But for other Yiddishists and for Yiddish readers, Chaim Grade was very wholesome. He depicted pre-war Eastern European Jewish life in a way that sort of made it look serious and respectful, whereas Singer wrote these crazy stories about magic and having sex with devils. And so a lot of people in the Yiddish community didn't like that. They didn't like being represented that way. Of course, there's also the fact that they were envious, and the Cynthia Ozick story you mentioned is called Envy. And they were very jealous of him because as time went on, the number of Yiddish readers shrank, and there was only one Yiddish writer who managed to get a big audience in English, and that was Isaac Bashevis Singer. So other writers were very antagonistic towards him.
Since 2009, I've been reviewing a book a week for the Jewish Journal. And I realized early on that I could easily fill my slot exclusively with books about the Holocaust, week after week. You've selected 5 or arguably 6 books about the Holocaust for inclusion in the blessing and the curse. Do you agree that the Holocaust has come to dominate and even distort Jewish writing, even if it doesn't dominate your book?
Yeah, I think it's obviously become one of the most important parts of being Jewish, one of the things that people identify with Jews and that Jews think about the most. One thing I wanted to do in the book was show how the Holocaust was the culmination of developments that the Jewish writers were already aware of 40 or 50 years earlier. So in that section about European Jewish writers, I start with Kafka and Arthur Schnitzler, who was an Austrian novelist and playwright, and I talk about Isaac Babel and Isaac Basheva Singer. And what unites all these people who were very different kinds of writers and wrote in different languages is that they all had a very clear sense that there was no future for Jews in Europe, that there was no way to see a good future. There was only bad things happening, and it seemed completely hopeless. And some people responded to that by becoming Zionists and leaving Europe, like S.Y. Agnon, who came from the same part of the world. He grew up in Ukraine and left and went to Palestine. Some went to America. Some became communists. But these Jewish writers were almost like prophets. They didn't know exactly what was going to happen. They didn't know how terrible it was going to be. I think probably none of them would have imagined that the Holocaust could happen, but all of them definitely knew that Jewish life in Eastern Europe was coming to an end. And they write about this in different ways, so that when you, in The Blessing and the Curse, after you've read these people, when you get to the books about the Holocaust, which are books of testimony, like the Diary of Anne Frank or books by Primo Levi, they seem like the culmination of something. It seems like this is the end point that Jewish literature in Europe was aiming at the whole time. Of course, even writers who weren't in the Holocaust, who didn't write about their experiences in the Holocaust, are very much thinking about it. And it's a major, major subject for Jewish writers in America and in Israel too. It's something that they can't stop thinking about until the end of the 20th century, and of course, even beyond to today. So I write about David Grossman and Tony Kushner and Saul Bellow all have things about the Holocaust that are central to their work.
Your book is divided topically into 4 sections, one of which focuses on the Holocaust, at least in major part, and another which focuses on Israel under a cheerful subtitle, Life in a Dream. Yet Hannah Senesh, who was a resistance fighter against Nazi Germany and lost her life in armed resistance, is treated in the section on Israel. I wonder what prompted you to put her in that category?
Well, the title for that section, Life in a Dream, was meant to be ironic. And I think that as that section proceeds, it's a sort of one of the themes is that Zionism began as a movement to make a dream, a fantasy, come true. And the famous Zionist slogan was, "If you will it, it is not a dream," that Theodor Herzl used. And this dream, in a way, did come true. They did create a Jewish state. But what the writers who I discussed, one of the main things that they're writing about is, if you're born into somebody else's dream, and this whole historical legend and myth has been leading to you, how do you lead an actual life? How do you become a normal person? And how do you become a writer? How do you become a normal writer if you're living in this very strange ideological climate, which is dominated by a great historical project? The Hannah Senesh in particular, I decided to put in that section because her diary, which is the main thing that she's known for, that she left behind, is partly written during her years in Hungary, where she grew up. And then in 1939, she made Aliyah and moved to Palestine. She was a young woman, still a teenager, when she decided that she was going to become a Zionist. She had not really thought about it much before. You can see in the diary, she was interested in literature, and she writes about her school friends and her life. And then one morning, sort of in 1938, she has this realization, I'm now a Zionist and I'm going to move to Palestine. And what was rare about that is that lots of Jews had similar realizations in Europe at the time, but very few actually moved to Palestine. Most of them were Zionists in principle, but not actually intending to make the trip themselves. And she was able to make the trip at a time when not many Jews were allowed into Palestine by the British, because she got one of the coveted visas. There were a very small number of visas that the Jewish agency was allowed to give out, something like 10,000, at a time when millions of Jews were in danger in Europe. And Hannah Senesh was chosen to receive one of them because she was a perfect Zionist pioneer. She was young, she was very committed ideologically, she was capable of hard work. And when she went to Israel, she ended up on a kibbutz where she was mainly responsible for doing laundry. And she writes about that in her diary. She says, now I'm here, I'm part of this great project, this great historical movement, and all I'm doing is laundry. And I'm not getting to do any of the things I had hoped to do when I was growing up in Hungary. I'm not going to be a writer, and I'm not going to be educated. So when the chance came for her to volunteer for this mission, the British were recruiting Jews in Palestine to parachute into Yugoslavia to help rescue downed British pilots. And it was an extremely dangerous mission, and they managed to get something like 50 volunteers, all men except for her. She was the only woman on the mission. And she was partly motivated by a hope that she would be able to infiltrate back into Hungary to rescue her mother, because when she Hey, can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh,
Yes,
we
you're
can.
back with us.
now you're back. You were
I got
frozen.
cut off there for a second. So she ended up going on this very dangerous mission and trying to get back in Hungary, and she was arrested and tortured and killed. And she became really an Israeli national heroine. She's someone who's very well known in Israel. Her poetry is known, taught in schools. There are streets named after her. She was one of the first sort of Israeli, before the Israeli state was created, war heroes. And so I thought that her story belonged in the story of Israel, because that's really where she made her contribution and where she wanted to be. And in particular, I liked writing about this in the book in contrast with the Diary of Anne Frank, which is much, much better known and has readers all over the world. And Anne Frank was only a couple of years younger than Hannah Senesh. They were basically of the same generation. She, of course, was growing up in Amsterdam at a time when Hannah Senesh was growing up in Budapest. But she had a very different experience, because she was younger, because the Nazis invaded her country earlier, and so she ended up as a prisoner in the attic, of course, but also because her attitude towards Jewishness was very different. Hannah Senesh really saw herself as a Zionist, and she wanted to get out of Europe and help build the Jewish state. Anne Frank, who knows what she would have thought had she lived, but in the years that are recorded in the diary, which is when she was 13, 14, 15, she's very much a sort of ordinary Western secular person. And she talks about movie stars and about the Dutch royal family and about her desire to become Dutch after the war, to become a Dutch citizen. And she, I think, appeals to a much wider readership for that reason. She's very identifiable. You don't have to be Jewish to understand what it's like to be, what it might be like to be Anne Frank, or to identify with her. And in fact, one of the things that she writes about in the diary repeatedly is, when will people just think of me as a girl, as a person, and not as a Jew? Whereas Hannah Senesh wanted to be thought of as a Jew. For her, that was what she wanted her identity to be. So it's an interesting contrast, and I thought they would both tell different parts of that story.
I have several more questions. I'm just going to ask one of them, and then I'm going to suggest that we turn to the audience and let other participants pose their questions. Adam, you credit Cynthia Ozick for warning against Jews who, as she puts it, auto-lobotomize themselves out of history. And you write that she is sure that it is not America that will remember or celebrate the Jewish writers. Only Jews themselves can preserve Jewish literature. but her observation raises a question for an author who seeks to address a readership beyond the Jewish community, including yourself. What do you hope the non-Jewish reader will find and use in the pages of The Blessing and the Curse?
That's a good question. I don't think this story is in this book, but there's a great story about how when Saul Bellow went to Jerusalem in the 1970s, it was before he had won the Nobel Prize, he wrote a book about his experience called To Jerusalem and Back. While he was there, he met a Jewish writer, I think it was Agnon, in the early 70s, or maybe late 60s, because Agnon died in the late 60s, so it must have been in the 60s. He talks about meeting Agnon and Agnon saying to Bellow, "Don't worry, now that your books have been translated into Hebrew, they're safe." And Bellow was very put out by this. He didn't like it at all, because he thought, I write in English, I'm an American writer, I'm part of an American tradition, don't sort of reduce me to being just a Jewish writer who's only going to be read in Hebrew. And Cynthia Ozick is a writer who had great literary ambition in English and wanted to be a great American novelist, a great English writer. But in this essay that I discuss, she says, in the long run, the only people who are going to care about Jewish literature are Jews. And she was saying this at a time when, as I had mentioned before, Jewish writers were very popular and everyone was reading them. But she says eventually Jews are writing for a Jewish audience. They're not writing for everyone else. Now, I don't think that's true. And I think that probably even she would agree that it's not 100% true. She was sort of exaggerating and being rhetorical at the time. But it is a good question if a writer like Tony Kushner or Saul Bellow or Philip Roth, particularly Philip Roth is a good example, whose work is very Jewish, but not explicitly all the time. Sometimes it's sort of in the margins or it's under the surface. Will those people still matter to Americans 100 years from now? In the America section of the book, one of the main things that I'm writing about is America was a place where writers for the first time felt like they were no longer part of a Jewish story. They were now part of an American story. And almost all of them thought that was a good thing, especially in that generation, that first generation or two. People like Bellow and Roth thought of Judaism and the Jewish communities they grew up in as ghettos, and the main action was somewhere else. It was in the English language and the English departments. That's where they wanted to be, and that's where they ended up. But part of that is thinking Jews, what that implies is the Jewish story is over. We don't have to think about ourselves that way anymore. We now are Americans just the way people come from Italy and Korea, and then they become Americans, and now they're Americans. That's their identity. But with Jewishness, it's different because in addition to being an ethnicity and a language, it's a religion. And not everyone wants to give that up. Not everyone wants to merge into the American story in that way. Ozick, in particular, thought that people who believed that that was going to happen were deluding themselves. And in that essay, she said, right now, there's not a lot of anti-Semitism, but it's going to be. There will be. It'll come back just the way it's come back every other place Jews have lived in history, and we will end up leaving America and being expelled. And in the distant future, the only people who are going to be interested in the experience of Jews in America are Jews, just the way now it's Jews who read medieval Hebrew poetry or other Jewish texts from different periods. So it's a very pessimistic view in a way, and certainly not one shared by most of the other writers that I talk about, but I thought it was worth including and keeping in mind as a sort of counter proposition.
Thank you, Adam. Bert, would you like to invite in some of the participants?
Yes, I would love people to put their question in chat or raise their hand. I'd like to ask a question, though, and it sort of follows up on the point that you were making. In discussion of Bellow, you quote this, life here and now is full of possibilities. Do you see him as optimistic in some way, separate from the historic Jewish burden? And the same kind of question about Roth, about whom you write. Where do you see him in terms of carrying with him sort of the through line that you keep in mind throughout the story, starting with the Europeans and moving forward?
Well, Bellow and Roth are the two sort of greatest, I think, American Jewish novelists. They're the really great ones. And they knew each other, of course, and they were friends. Roth was of a younger generation than Bellow. He was about 20 years younger. But they're very different. They're very different writers. Bellow is very metaphysical and spiritual. He's very interested in philosophy and mysticism. And he's a fundamentally, I think, positive and affirmative writer. And Roth is the opposite of those things. He's completely uninterested in religion and metaphysics. He doesn't believe in God. He doesn't think there's any value to religion. He's only interested in what's going on here and now. He's very satirical. He likes to make fun of things and of people, and particularly of the sort of organized Jewish community. So there are two very different sort of ways of thinking about Jewish experience. And it goes to show that when you're talking about literature, as I do in this book, there is no one right answer or one story. This is the way it is to be a Jew in America. These are all different people using their imaginations to tell different kinds of stories. They see different things there. But the question of what makes them Jewish writers at all is interesting, and they both grappled with it, because another element of this story of American Jewish literature is that when Jews came to America in large numbers from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1920, which is when almost all people, all of us who are American Jews now, 90% of us, our ancestors came to America in that period, in this great emigration from Eastern Europe. They basically lost everything that had defined being Jewish for centuries. They no longer spoke a Jewish language, Yiddish, the way people had done in Eastern Europe. They didn't know traditional Jewish texts. They might know the Bible or the Torah, but they certainly didn't know the Talmud or other things that Jewish men had studied for generation after generation. They didn't live in exclusively Jewish communities the way Jews had always done in Europe. So all of these things were lost. They were, and in fact, some of the very first American Jewish novels show that they were happily lost, that people would come off the boat and the next day they would shave their payas off. They were ready to be American. They didn't want to try to preserve an enclave. So if that happens, and then you're born in a family where you're raised without any of those things, maybe your parents knew them or your grandparents knew them, but you don't know them. What is your relationship to Jewish tradition? In what sense are you a Jewish writer other than simply the fact of birth? You have to decide whether that is an important thing to you and how you're going to interpret it, how you're going to assign meaning to it. And they did it in different ways. For Bellow and Roth, they really were most interested in being part of a Jewish community in America. Particularly Roth writes a lot about what is the psychology of American Jews. And he does it brilliantly and very, very profoundly and sort of penetratingly, which is why he was so controversial, especially when his first books came out in the late 50s. A lot of rabbis denounced him, organized Jewish communities denounced him. They thought he was making Jews look bad. He was telling sort of secrets in public that people didn't want told. Ironically, of course, 50 years later, he was given an honorary degree by the Jewish Theological Seminary. So he ended up being a spokesman for the community. But a lot of people thought this is not right for a Jewish writer to write this way, and they were worried about it. And in one of his later novels, Roth quotes a letter that he got when his own first book came out. The fictional character in the later book, his sort of alter ego, gets a similar letter from a rabbi who says, would you have written this way if you were in Nazi Germany in the 1930s? And Roth says, that's exactly the point. We're not in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. We're in America in the 1960s, and here we're completely safe, and we can say anything we want, and we can tell the secrets and just be ourselves. We don't have to worry about what people think. That was really the first time, probably in history ever, that Jews could feel that way and write openly in a non-Jewish language for non-Jewish audience about delicate, sensitive Jewish subjects. And I think that was a moment in history in the late 20th century that won't necessarily last forever.
Kelsey, do we have some questions or hands up?
We do indeed. We have one from Alan in the chat who asks, do you feel that this generation of American Jewish writers, so this means Jonathan Safran Foer, Dara Horn, Nathan Englander, are more conscious of their roles as Jewish American writers as compared to the likes of Malamud and Bellow? Is Roth, who also spans the early 21st century, in a different category from his literary forebears?
Yeah, I think that's a very good observation. They are different. and in ways that are both positive and negative, I think. Bellow and Mellon and Roth were writing in this period after the Holocaust, when anti-Semitism had become very taboo. It had, after really obstructing Jewish writers in English in America for a long time, it sort of disappeared. And in fact, things went the other direction, and people became very interested in Jews and wanted to hear what they had to say. So Malamud and Bellow and Roth were writing sort of about Jews for everyone. Now I think we've gone through a major cultural change, not just affecting Jewish writers, but all writers, which is the rise of multiculturalism, so that it no longer feels like you have to give up what you are in order to write for Americans. Instead, you write about what you are and who you are and expect Americans to be interested or not. But just in the same way that Junot Diaz writes about being Dominican and Jhumpa Lahiri writes about being Indian, the younger Jewish writers today are much more interested in Jewishness than Bellow and Roth were. For them, they were sort of Americans first. For a lot of these writers, they really want to know about things that Bellow and Roth had no interest in, like the Talmud, like Jewish myth and legend, like going to synagogue, which is something that those older writers never did. So there's a lot more Jewish content in those younger writers that you mentioned, Nathan Englander, Jonathan Safran Foer. They write about Judaism in a way that older Jewish writers didn't. And that's both a reflection of knowing more and caring more, but also I think of having a smaller audience and expecting that they're mainly being read by other Jews who are going to be interested in these things and not just by everyone.
Kelsey?
Yes, we've got more questions coming in. This is from Catherine, who's curious, where do you see the first Yiddish left-wing generation of American writers, for example, Michael Gold, fitting into your chronology of Jewish writers?
I don't include Michael Gold in the novel, in my book. He was known for this book, Jews with Money, but I think that it's not really a very good book, and it's probably not very much read today. It's true that in the 1930s, there were a wave of radical left-wing Jewish writers for whom that was a big part of their Jewish identity. And of course, that was true for the first generation of Jewish immigrants. Many of them were manual laborers and garment workers. They were socialists and unionists. And to this day, I think that legacy informs what a lot of American Jews think of as their identity of being staunch liberals. So in the 1930s, you had people like Gold or Clifford Odets. I don't write about them in this book, partly because I think that they're not the most interesting writers. They're not, because they were very political and trying to make political arguments at a time during the Depression when things were intensely ideological, they weren't writing as interestingly or as deeply about Judaism or Jewishness or themselves. And it was really the writers who were at an angle to politics who I think are the more interesting ones, like Bellow, or looking at the 1930s, like Delmore Schwartz, who I write about, who was an experimentalist and a sort of avant-garde writer at the time. Although there are certainly, I go on to write about writers who are very much in that tradition, although they lived later, like Grace Paley and Tony Kushner, who are very much thinking about Judaism, Jewishness as connected with left politics.
In that vein of writers and where they fall along the spectrum, we have a question from Stephen, who's curious where Gershon Sholem and Walter Benjamin and the search for a more mystic, powerful Judaism fit in.
I don't talk about either of them in the book because they're very difficult and sort of specialized writers. They're writers who, you could say that they're writers in a way, or writers for intellectuals. They weren't writing for as big an audience or in the same way as some of the other people in this book. But they're fascinating, of course, and I do read them and find them very interesting. In the 19-teens in Germany, 19-teens and 1920s, there was a really fascinating Jewish revival. That had a lot to do with Zionism, where young Jews who had been raised in families that had no Jewish observance and no Jewish practices were completely assimilated, and in some cases even converted to Christianity, rebelled against them, and they went back in a search for roots. they wanted to sort of give their Jewishness content and make it mean something again. The one writer in The Blessing and the Curse who is in that category is Martin Buber, who went on to write for many years in Israel, but started out as a German Jewish literary figure. And I talk about a book of his which was based on lectures that he gave to a Jewish student group in Prague. And in fact, Franz Kafka was in the audience for these lectures. And they're called Three Addresses on Judaism. And they're basically sort of revival sermons addressed to assimilated young Jewish men saying, don't try to pretend you're not Jewish, don't be ashamed of it, embrace it and make it mean something to you. And Buber had various ideas about what that meant, which were eccentric and definitely not about traditional Jewish observance. He wasn't saying become more religious or become Orthodox or start keeping kosher. He was saying things about sort of the Jewish spirit and soul and the spirit of dissent. And for him, one of the great Jewish prophets was Jesus, an idea that did not win him a lot of fans in the Jewish community, particularly after he moved to Israel, when a lot of people thought of him as almost like a traitor. In fact, there's a story about Martin Buber that a young sort of admirer of his in Israel, came to him and said, people say that you have a picture of a cross on your wall. Could that really be true? And he showed him that it was like a landscape painting of a European city where you could see a church steeple. But that was so shocking because people thought of Buber as someone who was interested in Christianity and wanted to talk about it and wanted to connect it with Judaism in a way that a lot of people weren't comfortable with.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have from the audience.
Okay. Last call for questions. If not, I would like to just.
We've got one from Candace.
Go ahead.
All right. If you would like to unmute yourself, please.
You hear us?
No.
Yes,
Yes,
welcome.
now we can hear you. Hi, Candace and Ray.
Hello. Hi, Adam. I just had a question about how you might see the place of Neil Simon as someone who exemplifies an important part of the Jewish tradition of how you stay alive and what humor does and the point of comedy, although some people wouldn't consider him an quote unquote important writer. What do you think about that, Adam?
Yeah, that's a good question. First, I thought about saying it earlier, but now that I'm actually talking to you, I will say that the first time I heard or was exposed to the Diary of Anne Frank was when I was sleeping over at your house with Josh, and Candace read it to us. That was the first time that I read it. So I don't know if you remember that, but yeah. Neil Simon, it's interesting that you mentioned him because my son, who may be watching this in his room, who's 13 years old, is a very big Neil Simon fan, and he has read a whole bunch of his plays and his memoirs, and he's very interested in theater and particularly in Neil Simon. He is maybe part of the story of Jewish comedy in America, which is a whole other story. In fact, there's a good book about that by a writer called Jeremy Dauber, it's about the history of Jewish comedy. One of those extraordinary things that happened with Jews in America is that they went from this very traditional culture of Eastern Europe where they were cut off from the secular world, cut off from the non-Jewish world, very occupied with traditional religious texts, then came to America, and the next generation grew up to be these comedians that everyone loved, and also musicians, that everyone really loved this sensibility. And so much of the sensibility of American comedy and television, sitcoms, comes out of Jewish writers. So it would be interesting to think about why that is. What about this sensibility is Jewish and what made it interesting to people? Neil Simon is one of the prime examples. And it continues today. You could think about like Larry David and Sarah Silverman and Judd Apatow. There's a whole lot of Jewish comedy, but I don't get into it in the book. It's sad.
Well,
sad.
thank you.
Next book.
Next one, maybe. Yeah. Yes, Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, someone said in the chat.
Of course.
Kelsey, last question.
Yes, last question is coming from Laurel, who is absolutely delighted that you wrote about Cynthia Ozick. I was wondering where you place her as well as women Jewish writers.
Yes, so Cynthia Ozick is a really unusual American Jewish writer, partly for reasons that we discussed earlier, that she's very pessimistic about assimilation. And she is one of the few Jewish writers who wants to be a Jewish writer first, talking about who wants to be a Jewish writer. She definitely does. That's the center of her identity. She also is interested in Judaism and Jewish theology in a way that most American Jewish writers are not. A lot of her stories are about the idea of idolatry and how idolatry is forbidden by Judaism but demanded by art, and how those things go together. I think that the 20th century, in terms of women writers, was the first century in Jewish history in which there were women writers. Before the 20th century, women in Jewish communities mostly did not learn how to read or write Hebrew, which was the language of religion and of scholarship and of sort of serious writing. They knew Yiddish, and there was a whole sort of industry of making books in Yiddish for women. There was a Yiddish version of the Bible that was directed at women and was sort of Bible stories interpreted in ways that women could use, with lessons for them as mothers or as homemakers. But there are no really prominent Jewish women writers at all until the 20th century, with a few exceptions. And so women finding their place in Jewish literature and in Judaism in the 20th century is another great story within the larger story, which I talk about in the book in terms of certain writers and also in terms of religion and how to make Judaism a more inclusive and gender neutral religion. The last book that I discuss in The Blessing and the Curse is by a feminist theologian named Judith Plaskow, called Standing Again at Sinai. It was a sort of revolutionary book of Jewish theology in the 1980s, in which she says, if we're going to really take seriously the idea that men and women are equal in Judaism, what does that mean we have to get rid of? And what does that mean we have to throw out? And for her, it means you basically have to throw out almost everything that has been traditionally considered Jewish, including the idea of one God. At a certain point, she says, before the Israelites worshiped one God, they worshiped many gods, and some of them were women, female gods. Maybe we should go back to that. Maybe we should honor the idea of having an earth goddess and things that really Judaism was defined at the very beginning in the Torah as getting rid of those things. So it's a very radical reassessment. And to mention Cynthia Ozick, she comes up in this discussion as well, because she was violently opposed to Judith Plaskow and said, this is idolatry and it goes against the essence of Judaism to think this way. But that is another part of the story. And gradually throughout the 20th century, women writers became more prominent and more central to Jewish literature. And I think probably when the story of the 21st century is written, they will be at the center. The 20th century is a story of them sort of moving to the center.
I note the time. Let me thank Jonathan and Adam for really an amazing evening. I feel so much worse for the evening because I'm reminded of how much there is to learn and how I'm slipping into my dotage. And the best way to begin, I thought, was to read The Blessing and the Curse as a primer on things that you really need to know about. The illustration of the power of books has really been astonishing to me, illustrated tonight by these two wonderful authors and men. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Adam. I hope all of you will come visit us at our new location at Chevalier's. As Kelsey said, we're opening tomorrow. And I hope you'll be rushing in to buy The Blessing and the Curse, the Jewish people and their books in the 20th century. So thanks everybody for being here and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.